Hello, and welcome to our British Cartographic Society Teatime Talk. My name is Chris Tributis, coordinator for the Teatime Talks and today's chair. Today's talk is from Seppe Cassettari, the BCS President, and he'll be giving his BCS President's end of term talk. So as usual, we'll take questions at the end, but please put any questions in the chat as they come though. So without further ado, I will hand things over to Seppe.
Thanks, Christopher. I'm just going to go straight to sharing my screen. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for taking some time out of your evenings to come and listen to this end of President's chat. It's been quite a week for me. Not only have we got an administrator in the BCS, so welcome to Catherine Coley, and I've spent some time doing some handover for her. Here I am doing Teatime Talk, and on Monday I became a granddad for the second time. So I do apologise if this talk is, let's say, a little less than polished. Maybe I'd like to have spent a bit more time on it, but other things have interrupted me. So this is where we're talking about. So the theme for this talk, you know, in the past, we've had the presidents, as they've passed out from their period in office, have got up and given a talk about something or other that's of interest to them or where they think things were going. And I've just got to the point now where I thought, well, I've stopped working. It's been some 40 odd years of a career in the geospatial industry. I thought it would be good and interesting, maybe as much for me as for you, to look back and see what the lessons are that I think we have to take looking forward. It's been a very interesting path for me that has been very varied, and actually been very lucky to be in the whole of the GIS revolution as it kicked off big time. So the story really is going to start when I started my PhD, which was in 1983. I started work in 79 for Ministry of Defence, but they were very good enough to give me some time, at least in the evenings, and pay my fees for me to go and do a PhD. And I'm going to be referring to that as we go through things. And just for the context for you all, 1983 was when Margaret Thatcher won a landslide general election. One of the big hits was the A-Team. If you didn't watch that at the time, you really had no conversation when it came to talking to people in the pub. And here's some of the pop stars from that period. Many of you will remember that, I'm sure, and there will also be many of you who don't. So we're going back into a time where things have changed almost beyond recognition in terms of our world, our mapping world. So what I'm going to do is pull out 6 things that I think have fundamentally changed in various ways and give some examples and talk about those, and use those then to identify what I think are the opportunities, all the threats, all the challenges, if you like, for the cartographic industry going forward. So let's start with that. I'm probably going to chat for about 45 minutes. Happy then to take questions, or we can have a nice chat about it all, see if we can decide on the future of the world at the end of it, and we can go on beyond 8 o'clock if people are interested. I'm happy to sit around for a while. So let's see, where did we start? 1983, what was the world like? So the first issue obviously is computing. When I started my PhD, I did it at Birkbeck College in London, and it was the Southeast Regional Research Laboratory in the Geography Department, and it was one of the very first locations where there was an installation of ArcInfo, the precursor to MapInfo, ArcInfo, ArcMap, and all the rest of it, ArcGIS. And we were running a VAX 11730 mini computer system, and the terminal that I did all the research on was like this Tektronix terminal here. It was a 24-bit terminal. That terminal, which I used for my PhD, cost about £30,000 on the day. PhD, when I wrote it up, was on a standalone word processor, and I stored my PhD on floppy disks, 5¼ inch. So that's the computing world that I started with. And I had done my degree between 76 and 79 and never touched a computer, didn't know what they were. So this was a really novel, exciting new world that we were entering into. Since then, of course, computing has changed beyond all recognition, and however you measure it, and the graph just gives some ideas of how clock speed or power, the number of cores and chips and so on, has changed. In some ways, by some measures, computing has changed over 1 million times at that period. So there's been a huge amount of change, almost unthinkable. And the impact in the way we live and work, of course, has been inconceivable. So that is the underlying issue for me in terms of everything that I'm going to talk about is the computer power. What I think is a given is that we look forward, we will do more quickly, and we'll do it in different ways. We'll have different ways of accessing geospatial information. So the things that I was doing, and I'll refer back to some of them as we go through the talk, are very antiquated now. But we don't quite know how these things are going to pan out. We don't know what is the next technology, what's going to be the next greatest thing, what's going to embrace us. But the question I think that comes to mind when I'm thinking about the computing power is, just by having more power and different devices, does that mean that we do things differently? And does that mean that we will do things better? And I think that is the challenge that we're going to be faced with. So that's issue number one, is computing. And that's probably everybody would agree with that. For me, the second issue, the one that has fundamentally changed the mapping world, or will do, is the issue of Earth observation. So this is a very simple graphic here that I've pinched off the web. You'll find all my graphics have been pinched off the web in the last couple of days. But this one just tells the story of the Landsat satellite, Earth observation satellite series. So when I started my PhD in 1985, Landsat 1, 2, and 3 had been launched, and we were all very excited about it. And we were getting 80-meter resolution satellite imagery. 85, Landsat 4 had been up for a couple of years, and Landsat 5 went up. And those two were revolutionary at the time. They were giving us 30-meter resolution. Since then, of course, we've had loads of satellites go up to collect Earth observation data. And according to the Union of Concerned Scientists in America, there were 1,052 EO satellites in orbit at the start of 2022. And you can measure this in all sorts of different ways, but a typical satellite may capture hundreds of terabytes of data a day. You think about that. We could be talking about 30, 40 million terabytes of data a day that we're capturing. And of course, today, where we sit now, we have not only those low resolution 30-meter satellites, we have mid-resolution 5 to 30, and of course we have the high resolution up to 1 meter and beyond now of satellite data. So that has changed dramatically, and it's not just the standard, real images that we see. We've got infrared and multispectral and all the rest of it. We've got loads and loads of satellite data, but that's only one component of the Earth observation. The second component is what we've been doing for a long time, which is fixed wing, heliborne, aerial imagery. And I'll just refer back to this because I think it's important to understand the context of the resolution, the quality of these things. So after I left MOD and joined Long-Range Geoinformation, we ended up funding a series of aerial surveys that we published as datasets called Cities Revealed. The very first one of those was central London. These two images are from that. It's from 1994. So we haven't gone very far beyond my PhD. We're only sort of 10 years later. And now we're creating datasets covering the whole of London that we're looking at for the first time on 24-bit PC technology. And that 25-centimeter resolution still stands the test of time for many places. The UK now has a standard 10 centimetre resolution, and in many places it's 5 from aerial. The big difference is that we've gone from film-based data collection to digital. And it's the digital collection that's revolutionized what we do. So that's the second component in Earth observation. The third one that's even more important, to my mind, is the rise of drones. So drones have become used very widely in survey, in all sorts of projects. And it's interesting to see what a dramatic impact they are likely to have on the world in which we collect data for using in maps. And I've just got one example here because I was involved fairly recently in doing a village history project, and we did a drone survey of the village. And here's the stats for it. The village covers about 2 square kilometers where I live. It took about 3 hours to fly. We processed all the data in 3 days. We've ended up with somewhere between 160 and 170 terabytes of uncompressed data. And we've ended up with a resolution of 2 to 3 centimeters. And what that means is I can see the number of tiles on a roof, or I can pick out the number of paving blocks in a path. Huge amounts of detail. Now, that obviously raises questions about personal privacy and access and so on. But nonetheless, we have the technology to collect this level of data. So we have 3 levels that's going on at the moment: satellite, fixed wing, heliborne, and drones. I think my next slide sort of sums up my view on all this, and I'm not the only one to think about it. We are exposed to a deluge of Earth observation data. It's actually very difficult to find a photograph of a deluge. So I took a picture of this fairly famous piece of artwork from the Metropolitan Museum of Art in the US. We will without doubt have more Earth observation satellites. We will have more surveys at resolutions of 5 centimetre and better for larger areas, probably national surveys, continental-wide surveys. There will be less restrictions on the use of drones as reliability increases. And believe it or not, even at 3 centimetre, it's very difficult to identify an individual. So the personality, the privacy issues are still quite grey in all of this. So I wouldn't be surprised if actually in the next few years we started to see national drone surveys using automated systems. So this is a vast amount of raw Earth observation data that anybody that's in the process of geospatial mapping, geovisualization has got to consider, because it's the fundamental base that everybody's going to be using going forward. Okay, that's number 2. That's point number 2. Number 3 then, of course, is the software. Now, when I started doing my PhD and then subsequently when I started doing some lecturing at Kingston University, this was the basic concept. This is GIS. This is what it's all about. We're going to divide the landscape up. We're going to split it out into layers. We'll have points, we'll have lines, we'll have areas, we'll have pixelized for continuous data. That concept was really fundamental and was quite earth-shattering, really, in terms of the way we think about how we monitor and manage our world. But we were doing all of that through command-driven software. Don't worry about what's on this command-driven line. In fact, I can't even tell you whether that's really a true picture. I just grabbed that off the internet this evening. But I was sitting there typing in lots and lots of command-driven to do some processing. So what was I trying to do? This is what my PhD was all about, which at the time seemed really innovative and novel. I think probably today you might say, well, it could get me a first as an undergraduate. It might be a little bit disappointing if I did it at a master's level. But what we were trying to do was predict whether or not, remember I was working for the Ministry of Defence at the time, a main battle tank weighing some 70 tons, and in this case I was using a US Abrams main battle tank, would be able to move across a particular landscape. And we were doing that by modeling the data that we had available to us. So we took contours and we created slope information. We took soils and took the information there about what they can, the impact that they can take from weight of vehicles on them. We took trees and woodland and looked at the different styles of trees, the gaps between the trunks, and whether or not a main battle tank could push through woodland. We took information about rivers and whether or not a tank could run up and down a river or cross a river. And we compiled this all together to create maps. So that's the fundamental concept of GIS, isn't it? Bringing all that data together and creating a map that gives you an answer to a particular problem. What were the differences between then and now? Well, clearly these are paper maps. We were not producing anything digitally. We didn't have large screens to work on, and certainly the end user didn't have. These maps would take about 8 hours to do an A0 map on a single line ink plotter. And the number of times they went wrong or the ink ran out, and it was just unbelievable. But fundamentally, that concept still stays true today. So I think the software principles are the same, but what's changed? Well, clearly what's changed is that we have really fantastic set of tools now that do take those principles, that very simple basic school view of GIS. We take that and we apply it through some really sophisticated tools. I was trying to think of an analogy for what that meant for me, really, and this is the best one I could come up with. So when I was doing my PhD, I was using a tenon saw to produce the models and create the data set. What people have today is an electric circular saw with all the gizmos that go with it. But fundamentally, we're still chopping up a piece of wood. And that gives us some food for thought, because actually, with all this data we're coming, we've still, and these fantastic tools, we're still fundamentally doing the same thing. So that does raise another question in terms of the GIS component to all this, AI. Now, I don't want to get into the AI discussion. There's lots of stuff about it and lots of thoughts about it. But I was looking at a blog from Hexagon, and Hexagon, most of you know, a big GIS player. And the blog is entitled, "Is AI the answer to the data deluge?" So that's not my title, that's theirs. There's plenty of people that recognize we are swamped with data. But what really struck me as being interesting was the first paragraph of that blog. And I'll just read out the first sentence. Within the next decade, the Internet of Things is expected to grow to an estimated 200 billion connected sensors around the world. We know that geospatial is about location. Everything has a location, and therefore everything can be mapped and everything can be tracked. And that, in terms of the software that we are working with, is the challenge going forward. So that's the third issue. Keep an eye on the time here. That's okay. Fourth issue. This is one that's sort of dear to my heart in a way, in that I don't think we have, as a geospatial industry, done ourselves many favors in terms of the information we collect and maintain, the management of our world. The map on the left, many of you will recognize as being a land use map from the second land utilization survey done in the 1960s, which was never completed. It was very expensive. It was a follow-up to a survey that was done in the 1930s at a coarser level. And that's as far we've sort of got, really, in terms of producing land use here in the UK. We have produced land cover. We've been involved in the Corine project, which goes across Europe. We produce our own post-Brexit land cover type mapping. But we don't do a lot in terms of land use. We don't keep very good records about what's going on where. We've created a national land use specification, but we haven't really applied it. And I'll just give you an example. The three photos and the text on the right here as just an example of why I think this is so important. Ignoring what you feel about any of these issues, where I live in my village, I will be within the area that the government has set out as part of the expansion of Cambridge. They want to set 150,000 new homes in the Greater Cambridge area. That would more than double the size of Cambridge. At the same time, we have a planning application in the potential for a solar farm that potentially covers 900 hectares. That will be the largest solar farm in Europe by some way. And it's in the same area. They're going to build 150,000 homes. And at the same time, all the new homes that are being proposed are being objected to by the Environment Agency because we have a severe water shortage in the Cambridge area. And the Environment Agency is also driving to stop the water companies taking extractions from the chalk aquifers. Whatever the rights and wrongs, whatever your views on any of those three things are incompatible. And we do not maintain enough information in terms of land use for people to make sensible decisions and plan them. We do it in isolation, too much so. It's my feeling. So let me just give you some examples of where I think we're making mistakes. These are projects that over the years I've been involved with, I've worked with. They've all been really interesting. They've all been quite innovative in their way, and all of them have been stood in an isolated form. So the two graphics on the left of London, you've got at the bottom a LiDAR survey, which has been extracted to give building information. You then have a classification of buildings in terms of their age and type and material, and that's been used for telecoms monitoring, and that was done at a national level. And I was involved in 4 different telecoms clutter models for the UK, and other companies were involved in doing clutter models for the UK at different times. You would have thought that we would have a national clutter model that is maintained and held as part of our understanding of our land use. We don't really. Thermal mapping, lots of that going on. There was a time when that was like the most important thing to do, because that was all about understanding our carbon footprints. We've not maintained that. We've not referenced that. And thermal imagery, which there is still a lot being taken, is quite problematic because it's not like the visible spectrum. It's a relative measure at a given point in time, and you have to understand the context of when it was taken. I did a survey looking at ancient woodland in Wales, and we extracted stuff from old mapping. We did part of the green open space agenda. The map on the top right is Glasgow. We did visualization data models for places like Lincoln, which is where this is with a view to looking at view sheds and making environments pleasant places to live. All of these data sets were all very interesting. People spent a lot of money on. They were used by the organisations that commissioned them, but they never made it into anything that was a consistent and monitored level of land use. And it seems to me that one of the big problems is that we do these things and then we lose them. They disappear. And of course, for so many of them, they've disappeared almost completely because we don't have mechanisms for putting those within the public domain through public libraries and the like. The other thing that I think is really important in all of this is that we're going to drill down to more detail. The EO data will let us go down to the individual building, to the part building, to the extension, to the number of solar panels on the roof, and so on. And so our land use has to be much more sophisticated than what we've been doing hitherto. And it's not just about knowing what we're building and where we're building, but it's also the use and how we change use. And it's not just buildings, it's everything else that goes with it. So the level of detail for land use and land management seems to be quite critical. And the last part of this land use one, I'm going to refer back here to what I've called process and change. And one or two of you may recognize this. The geographers in you will perhaps recognize these graphics. It was something that was done. I did this as part of my PhD. Well, you're looking at a landscape and you're mapping the processes that are taking part on it. So you're looking at the form of the landscape and then the processes that are actually happening on that so that you can see where there's soil movement or there's particular drainage issues and so on. Now, if you look at these maps, they're hugely complicated. These are maps produced in the sort of 60s typically. And they're very complicated. They need a lot of skill to interpret. But nonetheless, they give an awful lot of information about the processes that are going on and the change that's happening. And if I refer you back to the previous maps we were looking at, very little of them have any process or any change management within those databases. They're just snapshots in time. And that's not good enough. We've got to look at how we manage change going forward. So land use is the fourth component within all that. Fifth one, not surprisingly, and it follows on from four in many ways, is the third dimension. And yes, we talked about the third dimension for years, and we know that it's important, and we know that we've got to manage it in a way that is effective. But I would suggest that to date, cartographically, we've not even got close to knowing how to handle that data. I was involved in a project called UK Map, where we did an equivalent to Master Map of London. We created our own product, and we experimented with doing three-dimensional data, both externally and internally. And in this example, you can see the photograph, main photograph is Canary Wharf in London. The map on the left is the ground level map of that set of buildings. The map on the right has superimposed on it the internal structures of the public spaces. And I've pulled those out and dropped that down the bottom into the green and pink and purples, where we have internal retail space within the structures that go on within Canary Wharf. How we handle that information within a mapped environment is a big challenge, I think, still for us all. We're beginning to move closer to the world of BIM, business information management, which is going on in the survey and construction world. And we've got to think about how we communicate the three-dimensional aspects, which is a very dynamic, changing world, to people who use these sorts of databases. And I'll just give you one example where it's so difficult to do this. Those of you at the 60th conference in Cambridge last year may well have sat through the talk that was given by London Search and Rescue. And since that talk, I've been helping them with a bit of a project that I think they're struggling with. So this photograph, if you don't recognise, is the Barbican in London, built in the 1960s. It's an amazing achievement of architectural design and complexity. And it's incredibly complex as an environment. And if you look at the base mapping that you would get from Ordnance Survey, it is as you would expect, but barely reflects the complexity of that environment. So what London Search and Rescue have got is a real problem in this area. A lot of it's residential. It's managed by the City of London. It has a lot of people there who bought their homes when it was first built in the 60s. And we have an aging population. And with an aging population, we have quite a high incidence of dementia. So we regularly, well, the charity is regularly having to deploy their teams in support of the City of London Police looking for people. So look at this environment. You can see where this photograph is taken from. It's on a walkway, which is half underneath the building. And you can see that walkway continues to the right across between the pillars of the main residential area. That is somewhere you can walk all day, all night. It's a publicly open access area. There are some parts of the Barbican that you as a public cannot get to, but as a resident I can get to. So in the water feature, you'll see there's some vegetation and some sort of round, sort of circular brickwork structures that you can walk into and sit and get to. And you can see that the water isn't on one level, it drops down a level. So if I'm looking across the whole of the Barbican, which is quite a large area, probably ground zero is the water level. I'm probably at level 2. The water beyond is at -1. And these structures we're having to deploy a team of people to find individuals who've probably passed out with cold. They're behind one of these pillars, they're in one of the lift shafts, they could well be in one of these sort of areas in the water, and we've got to find them quickly. So we've got to make sure that we deploy teams so that they don't miss any areas out and they don't do areas more than once. So you end up with very complicated mapping which collects multiple layers, so we can search all of these layers. And there is a lot of layers here. Well, I think that it's sort of, if you take it as ground zero being, or the ground level being 0, it goes down to -4 and up to about 37, I think. So if you take all the tower blocks into account. So managing complex 3D worlds with our mapping is something we need to think about, and that ties into the whole land use structure. And this is not just about residential area. We've got the Royal School of Music, we've got the Barbican Concert Theatre, we've got a public library, there's retail. It's a hugely complicated space to manage and think about. So that's issue number 5. Just give me a check on time. Go on. And then the last one, and I won't dwell too much on this, but actually for me, this is fundamentally important. Mapping quality. And we can talk about mapping quality for ages, but I feel in many ways we've not addressed the issues of quality properly. So what does that mean to people? It's the accuracy, precision, and classification accuracies. You know, the number of people who don't really understand what accuracy is anymore. It's quite major. It's about currency. The number of times I've only had £1 for everybody who's asked me about the age of aerial imagery in Google Maps, because they don't understand when it was taken, how it was taken. Is it not real time? You know, what does it mean? The copyright says that it's 2024. Is that not today? So they don't understand currency issues. They don't understand the consistencies, the resolution, and how you communicate results. And I just put the graphic at the bottom because it's a good example of what someone did in this study we did in our local village. They took the aerial survey, which was 10 centimeters, flown in 2008. They took the land registry data that was publicly available at that time, incomplete, obviously, and they took some LiDAR data that was 50-meter resolution in which the village sits, and they merged it all together, and they were playing it with it in QGIS, and they came up with some fantastic answers, and they were all rubbish, but they hadn't realized how bad they were. And I think that issue of mapping quality is something we really need to think about. Okay, so those are sort of 6 themes that sort of jumped out of me when I started thinking about this in terms of, you know, what's happened through my PhD and my working career and all the things I've been involved with. So I then thought, well, what does that translate into in terms of the challenges for cartography, for the mapping world? Now, I am not a cartographer. I've never sat down and designed a map. I'm about the goes into the mapping. And I think of cartography in a very broad sense, because most people today are not traditionally trained in any way to make maps, but we still make them and we still use them. In fact, the vast majority of people that I've worked with over my career really worked at the large scale end of mapping, at the landline master map end. And we do very little of that, actually, if you think about it within BCS. So it is an issue that we need to think about. So what do I think are the future challenges? Okay. So here's the first one. We know there's a deluge of data. We know there's loads of imagery, and it's all sorts. And I haven't really touched on it, but there is a vast range of new sorts of imagery coming up. There's a couple of photographs in this montage at the top of that, and you'll see that they look like they're the same thing. Well, those are stereo oblique photographs taken from a helicopter that are used by English Heritage to evaluate some of their sites. We've got lots of street stuff. We know how valuable things like Google Street View is, and there's lots more of that around these days. We have a lot more 3-dimensional capability. That blossoming that we had 3D TVs for a while, that was fantastic because people could look at a lot of this data in 3 dimensions. And we still have a lot of information in the historic record that we've never transposed into maps. Here's an example, right down the bottom right in the middle here. That black and white photograph just here is an area that is now Cambridge Science Park. It was a tank repair yard for the D-Day landings. A lot of contaminated land issues there, never been mapped. So what do we do with all this? Well, I wonder whether or not we're going to have to revisit and rethink the whole concept of photo maps. When I started working in MOD, one of the jobs I did was working with the Director of Overseas Surveys, which were very close by. I used to love the old DOS maps of the Seychelles and Indian Ocean and somewhere out in the Caribbean, lovely stuff. And actually, that technique of photo mapping, putting some additional data on a base map, has been used in many places. I even used it myself when we did a project in the Niger Delta for the local government down there. And there was lots of small little villages that were mapped out. That concept of bringing together all the good things that we have in traditional cartography, but with more of an imagery EO component and thinking about those other things, I think is something we're really going to have to think about. Otherwise, we'll get left behind. The imagery will keep happening and will keep being used. We've got to think about how cartographically we present that as valuable data. That's challenge number one. Challenge number two, and this again comes back to the project that I was doing in the village. And I said we did a drone survey, so firstly linked because we had a history project going on, but I also ended up doing a project with some people at Cambridge University. And I think the conclusion we reached was that at some point, we're going to have to think about increasing the detail we have in our large-scale mapping bases. What we have through MasterMap is brilliant. It is beautifully maintained. We are extremely lucky, better than most in terms of the quality of geographic information we have to link everything to. But at some point, we're going to have to say, is that good enough? Are we not going to need more detail? So here's what we did as a project with a couple of students, in which we've actually broken the buildings down into all their different components. We've added in chimneys, we put on solar panels, we've added in extensions, we put dates to those, there's all the ponds in the garden, and it's basically everything you could possibly think of, as a way of just assessing how complex mapping could be from something like a drone survey. If you believe my hypothesis that we're going to end up with loads and loads of drone surveys across the country, then we're going to be able to create this stuff, and maybe we can create it in a semi-automated way that will allow us to have a lot more detail in our base mapping. And that then gives us the opportunity to be much more inventive with our land use classifications and so on. So more detail, I predict, will be something that will be coming. We know it will cost a lot of money. We know it will take a huge amount of work. So maybe it will get done in dribs and drabs and just in key areas where it's needed. But it is something I think we're going to have to think about. And it presents us with challenges because actually it becomes quite complex, because you can see from that map, I mean, it's effectively digitized at a scale of 1 to 125 and is taken back to be about a 500 scale map. So the level of detail gives us new cartographic challenges in terms of how we represent that level of detail in our base mapping. So that for me is challenge sort of number two. The third challenge is the complete opposite of that. And I saw a lot of this when I was working with people like the insurance industry. In that, because we've got all this EO data and we've got all this existing map data, we've done all this project, we have a huge multiple set of sources we have access to. And what we're going to need is something that's much more dynamic in cartographic terms. And not only dynamic, but much more integrated in the decision-making process. And that may mean, as in this example, that the cartographic output is incredibly basic. And there's nothing wrong in that. In fact, this map is that building outline is just really poor, but it doesn't matter because it works. It does the job. Let me explain what you're looking at here. We're obviously not in the UK, we're in France. Some of you will remember that a few years ago, there was a building in Marseille that just collapsed without any warning, killing all the inhabitants in it. It was I think it was 27 deaths. And France has a huge problem And as we have problems ourselves, we've had similar things happen, although not to quite the same scale. But France has a particular problem with Napoleonic era buildings. So insurers, as one example, are looking to see whether or not buildings should be insured and what sort of risk they're taking on. So the two photographs of the buildings are the same building, taken from Google Street View, but at different times. The one on the left is older. There's someone in the retail, the shop's potentially open, there's someone living on the ground on the first floor. Okay, and in fact, there's somebody in the windows on the second floor and the shutters closed. A few years later, and it wasn't very long, if I remember right, it was only 3 years later, the same building when Google Street View went past, the retail's shut, the first floor is now boarded up, and you'll see the windows have got props in to hold the windows up in the building. And you could see that this building was in a severe state of stress, even from the earlier photographs. You can see between the second and third floor how the building's already crumbling. So very quickly analysing those images and plotting all of that information basically just flagged up with for an analyst working in a call centre, don't insure this building. If someone comes to you and says they want to insure this building, don't take it. The risk is too high. So all I need is a little, whatever colour it is, in this case they chose yellow, don't touch it. I think they had about 3 different colours, in fact, so it was don't touch it maybe, but double the premium or something like that. So making it a more integrated within decision making is actually quite a challenge, because at one level I'm arguing for more detail within the mapping, and at another level I'm saying actually you've got to make it much simpler for those who are not trained to use maps. So that's my third challenge. My fourth one is about data quality. So on the right, you'll see a map that you'd all recognise, a survey map from whenever it was published. I don't remember the date now. You go 1929, just one I grabbed and picked. But what's important about it is there's lots of information in there that helps me understand the quality of what it is I'm looking at. It's not everything, by a long way. Now, within the geospatial industry and the mapping industry, we've created standards that allow us to collect the metadata to have that information. We have there's a global ISO standard, 19115, and that's still current today. We could be collecting that data. My experience was, and sort of still is, that we don't. It's very expensive to collect that information, to add it in, and certainly to do it at a very detailed level on a polygon by polygon basis if you're changing and updating things. And so we don't collect that systematically, and we certainly don't provide to the end user understanding about what we've done to that deluge of data to make it usable for them. How have we rationalized it down? How have we simplified it? So actually getting back to data quality information is going to be critical. And if there's one thing where I think we've gone backwards in the last 40 years, it's about presenting the data quality. Not that we don't collect it in many different ways, and it's often buried deep in a website or whatever, in the T's and C's somewhere, but we don't make it readily available. And as people who care about the cartographic value of the products we're giving to people, we should think more about the metadata that we make available. And so lastly, then, that leads me on to the final challenge, which is one we all know about, and it doesn't really need repeating, other than to say, really, that's one of the big focuses that BCS has been concerned about, and that's map quality. So not only is the data got to be good, we've got to present it in a way that's really useful. And we all know there's myriads of opportunities to look at terrible mapping or terrible graphics and infographics. We have to tackle this problem really head on if we're going to make cartography be the real value that it should be within the decision making of our world and our environment. And so GeoVis was launched, as you know, and Paul and other people have been working on it to create some really interesting ways in which we can persuade people to think about how they present their data. We are looking at some of the new softwares that are available, and these are just two examples. There's lots out there. There's lots of opportunities to think about doing things in a better way. In terms of the GeoVis, with the new technology that's going to be coming, whatever that's going to be. And actually, I did discover in my loft just last week a 3D screen, which I guess many of you probably don't even remember, that came out from, let's say, maybe 15 years ago, or maybe not quite that long, 12, something like that, which was a double screen in one computer, and you could see everything in 3D without glasses. Technologies come and go. I mean, it proved very good, but very expensive. Didn't work. We have to think about the new visualization methods and make sure the quality of the cartography fits those, particularly as we're all using different devices at different scales. And that's one of the big issues I think we need to think about. So that's my fifth challenge. So that sort of brings me to the end of that talk, really. I would just say that from a BCS point of view, going forward, whoever is leading the BCS, who's ever part of the management team, there is a really exciting future for BCS within the context of the geospatial industry, because there is so much that the skills that people have as members of BCS that they can contribute to the wider industry. So it's an important role within an exciting future. Where that future is, well, of course, none of us know. We don't know where we're going to end up. We don't know what technologies are going to win through. We don't know how we're going to be living our lives in 2030, in another 40 years' time. It will probably be as many changes as there's been in the last 40 years. But that just makes it exciting. It's opportunities. So thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Seppe, for that. We'll move on to the Q&A. So now I have to ask if anyone has any questions, if they can drop them into the chat, and we'll happily work our way through them. Yep, well, okay, we've already got. Looks like we may. Yes, that's Barbara Bond. Thank you for the for offering such a brilliant insight into the challenges being faced. I can say it's been, and congratulations and welcome to the BCS Past Presidents Club.
I'm not quite there yet, Barbara, but thank you anyway. I'm looking forward to it. I've got until the AGM in June. And while we're waiting for you to type out your questions, I'm just going to put in a plea to anybody who's thinking about getting on to council, getting involved. We would love to have more. I'm standing down. I can't do any more. Paul Naylor's standing down from Vice. And unfortunately, Paul isn't going to be able to step up to President. So we may end up in a position which we've never seen ourselves in before, which is struggling to fill those two roles. Think about, how you can contribute to making the BCS carry on being as effective as it is within the geospatial industry. Enough of the sales talk. There's a couple of questions popped up.
Oh yes, no, we've got our first question that's come in. So, how do we improve joined up land use mapping? Is it too many agencies involved?
Not necessarily. I would say the biggest problem is we don't have a deposit for the things that we're generating. There is no obvious place to stick a 170 terabyte drone survey of a village in the UK for prosperity. And that will be true for all of those examples I showed you. They're obviously taken on by the institutions that commissioned them, used for a while, and then parked. We don't have a way of bringing those together. And perhaps if anything, we almost need a new institution that is the integrator of our data sets, perhaps brings them together in some way. Maybe that's a role that the Geospatial Commission should be thinking about doing. I don't know. It's just something that we don't tile. We reinvent the wheel too many times. We waste too much money. I mean, I know that's we've always done that through history. Societies do that, but actually we have an opportunity to try and bring them together because the technology does allow us to do that. It's an interesting problem.
Yes, no, I would agree. That is a horrifying challenge. It's a horrifying challenge trying to bring what is a astronomical amount of data, which has suddenly appeared over the last few years. The fact that we can generate, the fact you can happily generate terabytes now in what would have expected, what would have initially really just been down to a paper map once upon a time, but now it's a quite a considerable amount of storage at any moment. So it's a
I mean, Jim raised the point of data storage is a massive challenge. It's absolutely vast, and it is actually bizarre that some institutions are thinking of taking their digital aerial surveys and saving them on film, because we're going backwards, because actually that is a very robust way of storing that information in a way that takes up less space, because the cost of storing petabytes of data. I mean, I've just, as a final sort of hurrah with geoinformation, which I sort of Verisk, I've been helping them with the archive that various people are involved in, and we have petabytes of data. What do you do with it? We could just stick it in a skip and it wouldn't matter. Who would know? But then there's huge amounts of, surveys of London every 3-4 years that will have some value. And of course, like most data, it loses its value fairly quickly. And then over time, it gradually starts to pick up value again.
yes.
And so if we don't retain it, we will lose value for the future.
Mhm.
And I'm quite a strong believer that the past is actually a really good indicator about the future. If we need to know what we've done to make sure we do things in the future properly. There's so many examples when we were doing contaminated land studies of where we didn't have the information that was critical to. I mean, I'll give you one example. I know it's a couple more questions come up, but just one example. There was a brickworks in South Cambridgeshire, not far from me, in the 1930s, lined with asbestos. Every time they needed to replace the asbestos, they took out the lining, crushed it down, gave it to farmers who laid it down for farm tracks. Obviously, Second World War came along. We rubbed up a lot of the hedgerows, ploughed in the asbestos into the fields. We now have a massive issue of contaminated land with asbestos because we actually don't know what happened to all of that asbestos data. So that's just one of a myriad of examples. Anyway, Louis.
Okay. So moving on to a flurry of questions we've now got. So first one, do any of our academic institutions teach cartographic design and communication?
Simple answer. So the UK, I mean, the UK, I think, gave away a very strong position in the cartographic world. When we had the Director of Overseas Surveys and we were arranging for countries to take up their independence by providing them often with some topographic base mapping one or another. We were in a very strong leadership role and we had lots of institutions teaching cartography. Most of that's gone. I don't think there's any cartographic courses left. There's a sort of cartographic component in some courses, but there's not much. When I did that project I mentioned in Nigeria, it was really sad because the Nigerians wanted to come to the UK. They had the money to come to the UK. There was no courses for them. They ended up going to the Netherlands. Mm. So we sort of have given that away, and that is a problem. I don't quite know how you solve that problem. We've looked at it time and time again, but it's a difficult one to solve.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we've got a comment which looks at the changing face of things. So, what someone has written, I remember when I used GIS for my thesis in 1999. One of the older lecturers dismissed it, claiming he could do the same analysis with a light table and some tracing paper.
True, he could, but it would take him a hell of a lot longer.
Yep, that's exactly.
And it would, if you tried to do that for the land clutter database, the telecoms clutter database for the UK, well, he wouldn't get it done in his lifetime. We did it in 6 months or whatever it was, 9 months. So that's the difference. That's the power of technology, isn't it? The key thing is the principles have not changed. And you go back and all the principles for photogrammetry, which we employed into aerial imagery, which were developed during the First World War when we were up flying air photos for the first time, they all still survive. They're still relevant. The maths is all sound and solid. we just apply those now, but we apply it through a mechanism that allows us to do more of it more quickly.
Okay, so jumping on to the next one. It's the it looks like you've inspired. So it looks like you've inspired someone to look at something here. It's thank you very much, Seppe. All very interesting. I have just completed my first remote sensing course. I come from a background of landscape architecture, so I'm very interested in pursuing your land use map idea.
It's very interesting. The land, I always thought NLUD was a real missed opportunity when it first came out. I might be wrong in this, so don't quote me, but I believe the NLUD, when it was first developed, the intention was that it was going to be used within as a way of classifying master map. Now, obviously, master map have some land use in it. You know, there's some components to that. So I'm not saying that OS don't do any of it, but the idea was to make a much more structured, hierarchical land use database. And it was felt to be too expensive to implement. But I can understand that. I understand why. But I think that was a missed opportunity in terms of taking land use as a way of communicating all these different issues that we have.
Okay. So next one we have is lovely to reminisce, Seppe. Thank you. Just to remind you, I met the computer salesman and helped to configure, buy, and install the Burbeck VAX 11/730.
Yeah, and I remember how incompetent I was when it came to the computing. I was really useless at it. So it was what was so fun about that time is that it was just so different. I mean, I walked in to look at doing a master's program, and David Ryan, who became Director General of Ordnance Survey, was the professor, and he said to me, "Oh, what about this GIS thing?" And I've never heard of it, no idea. So it really was innovative and creative, and it's always fun to be in the early parts of things. And it was a really good team of people that were involved in doing that at Birkbeck. And Birkbeck wasn't the only one. There were several regional research laboratories.
Okay, and it looks like we've got the one final question here. It's how do other countries store their land use data in a better way?
Yeah, good question. I don't know about better way, but I think one of the fundamental differences is that because we don't have a land cadastre, we don't have this sort of surveyed ownership and all the information that goes with that. We don't collect it in the same way. And maybe that is a weakness. It may in some respects it's a strength because of the way the Ordnance Survey works, but in some respects it's also a weakness, it seems to me. And other countries do collect more land use information because they have the land cadastre that they pour the stuff into, because it has legal context to the way that their systems work. It's going to be hard. We're never going to go back and create a land cadastre. It'll be impossible to do that across the UK. So it does bear thinking about. Of course, many countries are far worse off than we are. You know, I mean, there's countries that don't even have postcodes, or all the things that we just take for granted these days. So I'm not sure I can answer the question straightforwardly, but as always, it's good to learn from what other people do, because there's always good ideas out there.
Okay, so we've got one more question that's come in there. Thanks for such a wonderful, interesting talk. Quite often, satellite views are regarded by the public as though they are actual maps. Can you say something about what advantages there are of making high-resolution map of a village rather than just relying on survey drones? E.g., solar panels are hard to see on the map, but easier to see on the images.
I agree. I mean, this is the challenge of bringing the concept of a photo map back into, raising that again as something that I think has value. So it's part image, part the cartographic component, the classifications, the symbology, the text, whatever it happens to be, that allows you to interpret it. How you do that is difficult. It is hard to do. There's no doubt about it. But I think that is something we should be thinking about. I mean, maybe BCS should think about it. Maybe we could have an award for photo maps or something going forward. It's the sort of thing where I think we need to think about what people use that imagery for, how they extract data, and think about bringing those two things together. The challenge is that lots of people will get access to EO data and will make interpretations of it and get it wrong. And we will end up with even poorer interpretations and classifications. So,
okay, so I've got a question. I've got another question here that I've that's been sent to me. It's is a challenge? Is challenge one related to the availability of advanced technology to unprofessional map makers?
yeah. We have to embrace the fact that it's not now just a discrete group of people that make maps. We live in a world where everybody can make maps, and some people with no skills will make brilliant maps, and some people with lots of skills still make poor maps. So we've got to understand that though that will still happen, it will happen more. There will be more maps out there, and we've got to make sure that the rules by which those maps are made or judged are something that everybody understands. It's a bit like going down the route of I don't know, the way you buy your food. I mean, you wouldn't pick up a packet of food now that didn't have the ingredients on it and telling you how many fats and saturated fats and blah blah blah. If you didn't, you wouldn't do it because you wouldn't trust it. Well, that should be true about mapping. We shouldn't trust map when we don't understand the contents, where it's come from, what people have done to it. And that's the sort of analogy that I think we've got to address, and we've got to make sure that everybody, even those right out on the fringes who are making weird and wacky maps, understand that those principles are still very important.
Yep, I have to fully agree with you on all those points. So another one is, can you comment on the vast increase over the years of those now aware of the use of maps, e.g. what is the market like compared to the 1980s?
Good question. Don't know. Clearly, the availability of maps is huge, and people have access to a lot more maps, but they have, I would say, less understanding of maps. Certainly, I mean, I did geography up to A level and beyond, but it's everybody at my secondary school, which was a secondary school in North London. My secondary school, in my year, I was the only one that went to university. There were more people in my class that went to prison in the first 6 months that went to university. So it's sort of, but we all did maps. We all use maps. We did it as part of our CSE if they were doing that, or O level if we were doing that. And so mapping was something everybody saw and was aware of. Today, people, I suspect, understand them less, because they're not introduced to them so much in schools. I mean, the value of the Restless Earth program is proven by the fact how many people come back to them and say, this is really valuable way of teaching people why maps are important in a decision-making process. And we need to make sure that that happens, across the board. It's like anything. I don't know. It's a bit like your car, I suppose. In the day when I was doing my PhD, I could get in the bonnet of my Golf and I could fiddle around with it and fix it. Today, I wouldn't even lift the lid of my new car. It's just beyond me. But so I've got to understand what the parameters are that make it work, and when it starts to go wrong, what I do about it. And I think that's it's true with maps today. Everybody's got access to them. It's easy, but they don't necessarily understand them or not necessarily be able to interpret them. I think I've rambled on a bit there, but anyway, get the point.
No problem. And just jumping onto one other question we have. Lots of good comments coming in for you, as you can probably see. We've attribution in data is a lot better than it used to be, but ensuring it's accurate and maintained to an agreed currency is very hard. If you had a magic wand, how would you address this?
Yeah, start again. I agree. There's a lot more attribution, and it is a lot better. And there are many people who work very hard to make sure things like consistency are achieved and are measured. But as more people collect geospatial data and chuck it into these pots, it's easy to see how that things will not, if we're not very careful, the attribution will be poorer. So I think if I had a magic wand and I could actually change things, I think what I would do is actually make everybody go through one person who understood it all, and that one person will make sure everything is consistent and accurate and has the right quality. Be a very impressive magic wand if I could do that to somebody, but it would I think that's the problem. We've got this inconsistency and we're living with it, and inconsistencies get embedded and get hidden, and then that data might not be very good, but we now accept it as truth, and then we use that to build onto it, and so we're in danger of building house of cards.
Okay, so I think we've run out of questions. As I said, there's been quite a few good comments. Thank you for the talk. It's generally been quite another one of these another interesting talks that we've been able to host, and it's always interesting when we get this long view of cartography from, and particularly how the technology has changed, really accelerated over the last I'd say 2 to 3 decades. It's accelerated substantially more than as it's gone. So I have to say, thank you very much, Seppe, for that. It's been a very interesting talk, as usual.
Welcome. And just to finally say thank you to the BCS for allowing me the privilege of being president for 3.5 years. I'll be looking forward to handing it over.
Absolutely no problem there. It's the chain of office weighs heavy on weighs heavy on the shoulders. So I want to say thank you very much to everyone that joined us today. Thank you once again to Seppe for his talk and for the remaining portion of his term as president. So next month we return to our Mapping My World series, where we'll be learning about mapping in India. So look forward to seeing everyone at our next talk. But for today, thank you and goodbye.